So just some quick housekeeping rules. There, you should not have access to your camera and microphone for this webinar. That's not because we don't want to hear from you, by the way. There's just a lot of content to cover. So if you have thoughts, questions, things you want to say, throw it in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. We'll keep an eye on it so that we can make sure everyone's questions get answered. But with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jackie Swihart. Many of you know Jackie as she used to be the Indiana Main Street coordinator, but now is with Main Street America as a program officer for revitalization services. So we're really glad that she's here with us this morning to talk all about fundraising and budgeting, which is not the most sexy topic, but is a very important topic. And I know something that many of you are kind of trying to formalize and grow in as an organization. So thank you, Jackie, for being here, and I will pass it over to you.
All right, thank you, Abby. Let me just get my screen situated here. Can you hear me okay, Abby?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Yes, many of you, I see your names coming up in the chat and I recognize a lot of names. It's so great to see you again, even though I can't actually see you. I feel like we're at least in the same virtual room together. And for those who I have yet to meet, just a quick bio about me. Like Abby said, I am a program officer for revitalization services at Main Street America. I just happen to be located in Indiana. I am currently living in Indianapolis, but I grew up in the northern part of the state in the South Bend area. So it's always fun when I get to engage with my home state. So prior to Main Street America, I, as Abby said, worked for Okra as a program manager, primarily overseeing Indiana Main Street and the Historic Renovation Grant Program. Prior to that, I started my career as a teacher and I taught in public schools in South Bend. And so I love that Main Street allows me to still teach in many different ways. And again, so glad to see you all and be here with you. But let's jump in. We have a lot of content to cover. And if I don't get to it all, that just means Indiana has to invite me back for part 2. So we'll see. But I want to start out with grounding us because really we all know that fundraising, budgeting, like Abby said, not always the sexiest topics or the things that we wake up and get super excited to start thinking about or doing. But we know that in our work, we have a lot of different competing needs. We have competing priorities. But at the end of the day, a successful revitalization program has to have those financial resources that are necessary to carry out our work. And it's also necessary to sustain our operations. And so when we think about program sustainability, it really relies on the diversity of revenue. And so when I see this graphic, it to me really represents the fact that we are constantly juggling time, which I think of in terms of human capacity, with funding. And so both of these things are equally important depending on where you are in your life cycle as an organization. You know, perhaps you are all volunteer led. And so the time, the human capacity piece might be your primary focus right now, and that's okay. As you want to grow and develop as an organization, we are going to really have to start thinking more strategically about the other side of things, which is the fundraising, the budgeting. So that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to start with budgeting because before we can even really start to think about fundraising, we have to know where we are financially as an organization. So when we think about budgeting, this is going to be a very high level overview. I will send you follow-up materials, including the templates that I'm showing you, and throughout the fundraising pieces as well. All examples I'll share with you as a follow-up, so don't worry about catching everything. But when it comes to budgeting, you know, I think it's a really good place to start, especially if you're a new program. It's built within our baseline requirements. If you are familiar with our new standards of accreditation, the baseline requirements are really there not as something to check the box on, but they're really there to help guide programs as they're getting started, whether or not they're thinking about accreditation. That may or may not be the goal, and that's okay. At the end of the day, though, these are really great guidelines and milestones for you to work toward, especially if you're just starting out as a brand new Main Street organization. However, if you are a more mature program, a budget is still just as important for you to maintain and review regularly. So I just wanted to show you that within our accreditation standards, there is a baseline requirement for having a dedicated budget for the district's programming and the Main Street program's operations. Again, accreditation may not be your goal, and that's okay. Think of the standards and the baseline requirements as a tool to guide the work that you're set out to do. When we think about budgeting, there are so many different examples of what a budget could look like in terms of the way it's formatted and laid out. The one I want to share with you is a very basic budget worksheet that our friends in Michigan actually created. And I love it because it's very clear, it's concise, and it lays out a lot of different examples of items that you'd want to include in your budget. So when we think about budgeting, it's the same as when you're budgeting in your personal life, right? If you want to be financially healthy, you have to know exactly all of the items that you're spending money on. Where is your money going? You have to know that information in order to be successful in planning and thinking strategically about what you want to accomplish and how you're going to accomplish it. So when you think about a budget, think about things like if you have any loans that you're paying interest on. We want to include that as far as expenses. Think about administrative service fees, insurance, bank fees, and staff. Now, I know many of you may not have staff. If you do, you may not offer all of the things listed here. That's okay. These are just examples of maybe somewhere you want to ultimately get to, and just take what works for you and leave the rest. But we want to factor in staff budgeting in terms of salaries, especially vacation, medical insurance, if we're able to offer that, and any other benefits. We want to capture exactly where our funding is going as it relates to staff. Some other pieces that you would want to consider in terms of where your money's going: what kind of office related fees are you dealing with? Maybe you're paying rent, maybe you're paying utilities for internet. Some of this you might get in kind. I don't know. Take what works for you and leave the rest. Maybe you have membership dues or subscriptions, like to Main Street America or to your coordinating program or elsewhere. Always make sure you're building in professional development funds, and including travel expenses. So if you don't already, things like the community exchanges around the state, build that into your budget at the beginning of the year so that it's fair and you don't need to scramble and worry about how you're going to participate in something later on. Same goes for statewide conferences and Main Street Now and any other professional development opportunities that you are hoping to take advantage of. Put it right in the budget so that you know exactly where that money's going. And then, of course, you want to outline your budget for different projects. And so that might be things you already know you're going to do, like flower baskets. Many of you do flower baskets year after year. And so we know generally how much that's going to cost. So let's include it there from the beginning. But you might also consider thinking about future uncommitted projects. And so thinking about, okay, if we were to take on these projects, what would they cost? Go ahead and put that in your budget as well, because again, you can't really do anything successfully without really thinking about the resources you need to get there. So again, this is just a really simple worksheet that I wanted to show you. The template I'll send also has a very similar layout for revenues. And so thinking about what kind of grants are you perhaps getting? What kind of contributions or pledges or sponsorships? All of the things that are bringing in money, big or small, should end up on your budget. Even thinking about maybe some of your projects have revenue as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how to make some of your projects into more of a fundraising effort. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we know exactly how much money we are spending as an organization. We want to know exactly how much money we're bringing in to the organization. And just a quick note on balancing our budgets. this last piece here, this is where you're going to see either positive numbers, you're bringing in more than you're spending, or you might see negative numbers. And so thinking about our budgets being balanced, if your budget ends up in the negative, you can look for different ways to cut your expenses. However, we don't want to ever cut expenses when it comes to our staff. Let's take a look at things like events that may not be making money, but they cost a lot of money and time and resources to put on. Also, if you're in the negative and you have to think about cutting budgets somewhere, if you have already gone through the transformation strategy process, or if you're going to be in the near future, I'm here to tell you that transformation strategies gives you a really good reason to say no. So take a look at the activities that are on your work plan. If you need to cut somewhere, cut from those activities that do not align well with your strategy. So keep that in mind. We always need a reason to say no, and sometimes that strategy can be that reason. When we think about timeline or the process of developing a budget, I did want to share this resource from Propel Nonprofits. There is no one way to do this. So I just want to say up front that this is one example. Take what works for your community, but just make sure that these major components are somewhere within your process. So we want to start by determining a timeline. Set a target date that you want your board to approve your budget. Allow time for each step for review and discussion. Agree on goals. And that's really where work planning comes into play, which we'll touch on here in a second. But we want to make sure that the board is all on the same page in terms of what are we prioritizing for the year ahead, what are the financial goals we need to put into place, and how can we make sure everything aligns with our overall strategy. You also want to make sure, again, you understand that current financial status. And so make sure the treasurer, if you have somebody on your board who works in finance, these are great folks to really start looking at your budget, review the current year, think about what's to come, analyze and understand any variances, and then agree on the budget approach. So making sure we're assigning roles and responsibilities, making sure we all are on the same page in terms of who has authority to make decisions related to budgeting. Once you have all that in place, then you can really start to think about developing a draft expense budget. So thinking about, this might happen at the committee level. Maybe committees, as they're putting together their work plans for the year, they're the ones who are putting together that draft budget to then present to the board at a later time. Again, however works best is in your process, that's okay, but just making sure these major components are part of it. Once you have your expense budget drafted, you can think about an income budget. So project that income based on your current fundraising efforts, and then also brainstorm new activities that can generate additional income. Once you have your expense and income budgets, review. Verify that the draft meets your program and organizational goals. Make adjustments as needed. Make sure it's all aligning with your work plan, your transformation strategy, and the overall objectives. The board ultimately needs to be the ones who approve the budget, and so that cannot be a step that's missed. But however, you can start this process at the committee levels. And so if you're going to do that, think about at the end of the year, have the committee start thinking about their work plans, have them tie the financial resources necessary to do those work plans, sit down with the organization committee and the executive committee if you have one, plug everything in, refine it, and then send it to the board by the end of the year so that you're ready to go when it comes to be January. Also document your budget decisions. You want to think about succession planning. And I know many of us have probably come into an organization where we had no clue what the budget was, and that's a result of poor planning and poor documentation. So making sure that the processes that we follow are documented, and that way we have that plan in place moving forward and that institutional knowledge. And then the fun part, you get to implement your budget. You get to start thinking about, okay, how are we going to make this work? Who's going to do what? And you can move forward into implementation. The last note on budgeting, I did want to share the Strong Nonprofits Toolkit. I put the website at the top here. It's a really great resources to help strengthen your financial management. The toolkit itself has 6 different categories. And so the first will walk you through budgeting in a more concrete way, step by step. We don't quite have time for that today, but it'll also teach you and walk you through cash flow, operations, data and analysis, audit readiness, and then also governance and strategy. But just wanted to cover the basics here today with you before we talk about fundraising, because you need that budget in order to think about how you're going to fundraise and what you're going to fundraise for. So I'm going to pivot to fundraising. And the first thing I usually hear when we talk about fundraising in a nonprofit setting, but we're a nonprofit, we can't make money. And that's true to some degree, but I do want to kind of set the stage and bust the myth that as a nonprofit, we can't collect money for our organization. And so many of us are 501c3s. I know not all of us are. Some of us are C6, some of us are housed within city government. But generally speaking, if you're a nonprofit organization, that means you've been defined by the IRS as established for purposes that are maybe religious, educational, charitable, so on. I like to think that in the work that we do, it's really focused on education. We are in the business of people, we're in the business of convening, and we're in the business of connecting people to resources. And so we are educational in nature. The good thing about being a 501c3 is that you can incentivize donors with the fact that they can have their tax deducted from a donation. And so keeping in mind that, when you are soliciting donations or fundraising of any kind, to emphasize that there is that tax deductibility of donations. However, there are some restrictions when it comes to fundraising. The not so good part of it is that there are really strict rules that apply. And so making sure that you have somebody on your organization who is well versed in law and nonprofit management, so that they can make sure that what you are doing in terms of fundraising is okay. Um, Biggest thing, which may seem obvious, but we have to say it, is that no part of the activities or net earnings from fundraising can unfairly benefit any director, officer, or private individual. And so just keep that in mind. We also can't necessarily lobby, but we can educate. So that brings us to the last important piece about nonprofits. We do not exist to make money. However, we are legally allowed to take in more money if it means, we're going to reinvest it into our organization or reinvest it into the programming that we create. So we can, as nonprofits, take in more money than we spend in order to conduct our activities. It's okay if you have a surplus in your bank account. That's what we want. So now that we're all grounded on nonprofit fundraising and how those things work together, I want to take us back to those community accreditation standards. Again, caveat that accreditation may not be your ultimate goal, and that's okay, but it's a really great tool for you to help guide your work and think strategically about opportunities and gaps. I want to highlight the third standard, which is really focused on diversified funding and sustainable program operations. That goes back to that first graphic I showed you, where we're always balancing people, time, and funding. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into standard 3, which will help us understand why this is important. So when we think about fostering investment in the heart of our community, what the standard is really looking at is, do we have public and private sector funding sources? Are we doing fund development and fundraising? They're a bit different, and we'll talk about that in a second. Do we have a budget, and is it aligned to our work plan? Do we as an organization have financial management best practices? And when we think about that last piece, we're talking about processes. Are there processes in place to make sure that we are doing things like reviewing our budget? The correct and appropriate people are reviewing that budget. And do we have a process in place for all things related to our financial health. This standard also asks the questions: how is the budget aligned with your transformation strategy? How is the organization planning to expand strategic fund development and fundraising efforts? And it's also asking what opportunities exist to improve our financial management and oversight. So it's really thinking about building that solid funding structure for revitalization services. And the way we get to answer those questions is by making sure that our funding sources are diverse, making sure that we have an adequate budget for both our programming, but also our operations and overhead expenses, making sure our budget and work plans are aligned, but then also thinking about strategic fund development. So, good fund development is really a strategic approach to developing donor relations. And so, to move your organization from fundraising to fund development, that's going to require that you first have a good framework in place for fundraising. And then you take a more strategic focus in arranging fundraising actions in such a way that you develop relationships. So you can think about it in terms of fundraising, ask the question, how can I raise money? Fund development asks, how can I build relationships to maximize funding for our mission? So those are two different goals and objectives. Again, fundraising asks the question, how can I raise money? Fund development asks the question, how can I build relationships to maximize funding for our mission? So one is the logistics, the other is really that long game. And again, we're in the people business. Those soft skills are really important in terms of being able to build relationships over time. Effective fund development, no matter which way you slice it, is really based on having good information and in order to build those effective relationships. It really is a team sport, and organizations are going to achieve the best results if everyone understands what role they're playing in fund development. And in order to know what role you're playing, we need to have robust work plans. And so many of you have probably seen this template before. I think it's a great example that Indiana Main Street put together. If you're able to really pencil out, especially for a fundraising work plan, what the tasks are, who's responsible for that task, when it's going to start, when it needs to be complete, is it going to cost money? Are we going to bring in money? Do we need volunteers for this? Do we need staff hours for this? If we're able to really pencil out all those details when it comes to fund development, then there's no question about who's responsible for what. So we really have to build our fund development strategy off of good information, and that comes down to our budget, but also our work plan and making sure that those two things are well aligned. When it comes to a fundraising plan, kind of thinking a bit more about diversifying our revenue sources. This is one example of a fundraising plan. I typically recommend that you forecast 3 years out. This example shows you 2 years out, and that's okay. If you just need some place to start with 1 year. And then as you grow, as you start to figure out what's working and what's not working, start to forecast 2 years out, 3 years out, maybe even 5 years out. But when we're thinking about a fundraising plan, we want to think about income sources like our city. We would love if the city contributes financially. I know not all of us are quite there yet, but remember that fund development is a long game. It's about building those relationships. And it might be that multiple folks have to engage with the city or whoever that potential income source might be. Don't always have it be the executive director who's going to meet with the city. As a board, go ahead and send each board member to different meetings to just share about Main Street, what's going on, why they could use support. That way you're avoiding any personality conflicts. Maybe it's just two people don't really click. I think we've all had that experience, and that's okay, because really we're working toward improving the financial health of our organization. And so whoever the best fit on our team is for that, let's place them strategically with some of these different income sources. Other components of a plan you might consider. Some programs have a Friends of Main Street group, or another way to engage residents through fundraising. You might put on a fundraising plan things like grants, merchandise sales, sponsorships, special events, fundraising events, and a TIF or another assessment district if you have one in your community. Whatever the components of your plan may be, make sure that it's balanced. And so that's when we're thinking about where are our predictable sources of revenue coming from. This format here is a best practice. It's okay if you're not quite there yet. Think of this as an ultimate goal. And I always try to tell communities that we want to focus on having 3 consistent, predictable sources of revenue. That can be a goal. Doesn't necessarily mean you're there now, but it can be a goal. So ideally, in a perfect world, we want to see that 30 to 50% of our budget is coming from public funding. And that is usually government. That could be at the city level, county level, maybe even state level. Ideally, 20 to 30% of our funding is coming from our business district. That could be, again, if you have business and property owners, maybe you have a membership structure, or maybe you solicit donations either financially or in kind from your business owners. This could also include residential donations, partners, corporations, utilities, and so on. Ideally, 30 to 40% is community funding. That could be, again, residents, industry, businesses outside of downtown, civic organizations, foundations, you name it. This can be really catered to your community and what you need and who's there and willing to help you get there. And then thinking about just some miscellaneous income. Ideally, 5 to 15% of that income can come from things like special events, activities, merchandise, festivals. Any way you look at this, just think about what works for your organization, what works for your community and the folks who are in it. A best practice is usually 1/3 of our funding coming from the public sector, 1/3 of our funding coming from the private sector, and then 1/3 of our income coming from earned income. So slice that any way you'd like. The ultimate goal and idea here is that you have a sustainable stream of revenue. That way, if one of those major components disappears overnight, you can still move forward as an organization. I'll share this template with you as well, but one way to start assessing as an organization, if you have a balanced funding structure, is to work through a matrix much like this. So thinking about all the different funding sources that might be available to you, and really taking a look and reflecting on, are these stakeholders currently investing? And if so, how? Is it financial? Is it in kind? Maybe it's philosophical and we want to move them to a financial investment. And also think about untapped opportunities. So this is one example of a matrix of an activity that you all can do as a board, as staff, whoever, get together and just talk about these things, because it can really identify some potential opportunities you can take advantage of. In terms of the public sector, if you're not already partnering with the public sector, here are a few ways that you can. It's always going to start with that philosophical partnership. You have to be able to tell your story and get especially your municipality on board with what you're doing, the goals, the objectives, because that's going to lead to that financial commitment. They're going to start thinking about putting their money where their mouth is, right? And so when it comes to programming for downtown, we want to plan for physical, economic, and promotional improvements. We can think about resources for implementation, like contract agreements, incentive programs, access to grants. I'm going to share with you all an example of a memorandum of understanding that you might be able to put together as an organization. I know many of us, if we do have a financial partnership with the city, it's not always written down. I would encourage you to get this in writing because there is often overturn with leadership on the other side, municipality or the Main Street program. And so making sure that we have agreements in writing that really lay out the expectations of both parties involved, that's a really important tool for you all. Also, if you're on the side of things where you aren't currently as an organization partnering with your municipality, a memorandum of understanding is a good way to start that partnership. Oftentimes, city government might think this is a little risky to invest X amount of money into the Main Street organization when we haven't had a partnership before. A memorandum of understanding is going to make the city feel more comfortable in terms of what they're getting for their investment. And so laying out exactly what you as a Main Street organization can do with funding from the city is going to be really helpful in building that trust and building that partnership and also outlining very clear expectations. Just a quick note on membership. I couldn't really figure out where to fit this in, but I wanted to make sure that I at least mentioned it. Some of us do have membership-based programs, and that's okay, but we want to think about the language we use and be very intentional about that language. So I would just encourage you all, instead of thinking of our supporters as members, maybe we call them something like investors. And the only reason I bring this up is because sometimes when we call our investors members, that implies that there's something they're getting in return for a fee that they're paying to be a member. An investor, on the other hand, is somebody putting money into something in which they believe. And so thinking about Main Street as a program, as a philosophy, we're doing work for our community and we're targeting those resources in our downtown core to benefit the overall community. And you can get in a really sticky situation if all of a sudden someone's paying you a fee and expecting something very specific in return. So this can be a little bit of a mindset shift. And again, that's certainly not going to happen overnight. It all comes down to the long game. Just changing that mindset over time, reframing how you interact with your traditional members, and thinking of folks as investors. So that's a brief overview. I know it's a lot of information, even though it is brief, on fundraising, but I think what can be really helpful is thinking more about roles and responsibilities. Something I see no matter what community I am working in is it the board's role? Is it the staff's role? Is it the committee's role? And so that can be really confusing in terms of whose job and responsibility it is to fundraise. So we'll talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. In terms of what an ideal scenario is, it's really a partnership. There is never one person who is solely responsible for fundraising. And so just keep that in mind. The board in Main Street is intended to be a working board. And we'll talk a bit more about how board members can help with fundraising efforts here in a moment. We want to make sure, ideally, that there is a strong positive cash flow. And thinking about our bank accounts, are there 3 to 6 months of unrestricted operating funds? Because if there's not, and if something happens and we lose our staff or we lose our office, that can really be a setback to the organization and its mission. And again, just to emphasize that we really want to make sure our fundraising streams are balanced, they're diverse, and they're sophisticated. So we want to avoid relying on a single unstable funding source. If we have no stability, if we're having trouble meeting payroll, we're not able to really invest the energy, the time, the resources into doing the work that we all want to do. When we think about typical fundraising responsibilities, I put typical here because there is, again, no one way to do this. But just to give you an idea of what best practice might look like, when we think of the board, they really are leaders of the program and they're leaders in the community. They're the ones who, at the end of the day, have fiscal responsibility for the program's financial management. End of story. The board has fiscal responsibility for the program's financial management. The board should really then be establishing priorities that are driven by the organization's vision and mission and transformation strategy. And they're the ones who ultimately need to make sure that the programming we're coming up with is aligned to the work plan, the budget, vision, mission. The board are also the ones who are either going to lead or at the very least support fund development. And that can look like personal commitment, maybe it's access to wealth. But it all does start and end with the board of directors in terms of fiscal responsibility. If you have an organization committee, which I hope you do, these are the folks who can really start to develop and implement specific initiatives or events, materials that are going to foster funding for the program. So maybe they're the ones who are looking at partnership or investor campaigns. Maybe they're the ones who are organizing fundraising events. And you might think, well, shouldn't our promotions committee be putting on events? There's a difference between an event for the goodwill of the community and a fundraising event. And so fundraising really makes more sense to be within that organization committee. In terms of other committees, these are the ones who are going to help develop and implement initiatives that foster funding for specific committee efforts. And so once there is a plan in place for what activities are going to be happening in the year ahead, they can go solicit funds for that specific project. And so they are responsible for supporting fundraising activities of the organization. When we think about staff are the ones who are providing leadership support to the board and committees with regards to developing and managing resources. I hope that you see here very clearly that Main Street staff are not the ones who are solely responsible for fundraising. And I know many of you are probably smiling right now and thinking, oh, well, I'm responsible for that as a staff person. But I'm here to tell you that it is a team effort. Everybody has their own role within fundraising. And if you feel like your program has really gotten away from that team spirit when it comes to fundraising, reach out to Indiana Main Street. They can work with you to maybe do a board training or a fundraising training, something more in depth with your program to learn a little bit more. When we think about helping with fundraising, because I know that can be a challenge, you might be thinking as a staff person, oh, I'm going to go back and tell my board, Jackie said that you should be helping with fundraising. But then the question might be, well, how? And so some ideas for board members, you want to make sure at the front that you're very clear in your board member job descriptions that fundraising is a big part of their role. That way, no one's caught off guard. No one's going to say 6 months down the road, wait, I didn't sign up for this. Put it in that job description and be as concrete as you can. If your board members are having a hard time committing themselves to fundraising, maybe it's because of their own personal conflicts or other priorities within the organization, maybe lean on former board members to help. These are still going to be your advocates. These are folks who served time and invested in the program already. And so when we think about that leadership pipeline, when people, especially the board, leave our organization, they can still be our advocates. They can still be our cheerleaders. So making sure that we're still involving them, maybe in an advisory format, but they can help with leading that fundraising campaign. If you do not have an organization committee, establish one. And my suggestion would be to make the vice president the chair, because organization, again, not always the sexiest of the 4 points, but you really need to focus on it because that's how you're going to do any other work within the 3 other points of the 4 point approach. So we need to really make sure that we have stability and a strong foundation to work off of. And so because that organization committee holds a lot of responsibility, let's make sure that the vice president is in the chair. Challenge your committees to raise their own funds through their activities. Use the work plan to show how they will do it. So work with them. Don't just say, here's something you need to do. Again, we really want to catalyze this idea of we're all in it together. Everyone plays their role, but having the committees responsible for raising funds for their activities, that's just one additional way to build a sense of ownership over their work, a sense of commitment, and a sense of importance. And all those things are what's going to help keep our committees motivated and wanting to continue working and donating their time and energy to the Main Street organization. In terms of what individual board members can do to help with fundraising, I have 10 ideas for you. Maybe just take one of these. You know, you don't have to do all of these. Maybe a board member can help create or evaluate a plan for a fundraising event. Take a look at your events. If your events are not profitable, I would encourage you to really evaluate whether that event is worth administering or not. That doesn't mean the event has to go away. Maybe there's a partner in the community who's a better fit to manage that event. If you're able to take an event and make it profitable, that's where a board member can help think through those logistics. Maybe a board member is advocating for government money. Maybe they're providing intelligence on prospects. Everyone on a board typically is there because they know someone who knows someone. And so using those skills to make those connections can be really valuable. Maybe a board member is actually setting up a meeting with a prospective donor or a sponsor. Maybe they're cultivating the relationship with a sponsor to then become a donor. It could even be as simple as just sending an email, calling, or visiting a donor and just saying thank you. Simple as that. That would take maybe 5 minutes. Everyone probably has 5 minutes to do that. Board members individually can also be really good advocates and cheerleaders and explain to prospects why it is that they serve on the board. Again, we should never be telling the story of Main Street from just one source. A lot of this gets put on the director's shoulders, but it really should be a team effort. Board members should be also explaining to major stakeholders the importance of Main Street and the organization. They can even use their own private social media accounts to share funding goals or to even just share about the organization. Maybe they're recruiting in-kind service. Maybe they're negotiating a lower price for services that Main Street needs. And lastly, every board member should give. Not that there should be a set amount required. It doesn't have to be hundreds or thousands of dollars, but it should be a gift that is meaningful to that board member. Maybe a $20 donation is meaningful. You know, I'm not here to say what is meaningful and what's not, but every board member should give, and again, really put their money where their mouth is. Even if it's $5, $10, we should be giving. So the fun part of this is really showing you some examples of different fundraising activities that have occurred. So one thing I want to start with is thinking about fund improvement projects. We are all in some way, shape, or form as a community probably working on streetscape improvements. Maybe they're big things like a total, tear out of the streets. Maybe it's a small thing like fixing one curb. Whatever it is, you can really use these improvement projects to solicit funds. And so maybe if you're redoing a streetscape, thinking about selling bricks with people's name on it, a way for them to donate. In Ripley, West Virginia, they did this. They essentially sold each brick as a sponsorship for $75. People were able to put their names on it. And it's just a fun way for people then to come back downtown, take pictures of it, or just say, oh, look, here's our name, and walking around trying to find it. So bricks are one way to do that. I've also seen Main Street organizations use holidays like Mother's Day or Valentine's Day to sell sponsorships for flower pots and baskets. It'd be really cool if, as a gift for your mom, you could say, Mom, I bought a flower pot and it's on 4th Street right in front of the courthouse. And then you can go look, and it's just a really fun way to see their name there, and you can have your name there as well. You can do the same thing with banners, art installations, benches, trees. Think about the things that are already happening or already being improved, and how can you make those profitable? You can also consider reaching out to business owners, and that doesn't necessarily mean just your small business owners in your downtown core, but thinking about some other maybe larger businesses, corporations around the downtown, and asking them to invest. And so this is an example I will share with you. The person who actually put this together was writing to Cisco, and you can just say, here's how you're helping me, and here's how we'd like you to continue helping. It's really important, or I guess it can be more successful if this letter is coming from a restaurant owner who maybe uses the resources that Cisco, for example, provides. But regardless of who it is you're soliciting, making sure it's coming from the customer of that business so that it becomes more personal. I'll share this with you as a template, but it's a good way to just reach outside of your downtown, because everyone benefits in the community, regardless or not if they're in that district downtown. In Manchester, New Hampshire, they had a really cool program on community canvas murals, and they wanted to put together 7 murals through different events. And so they created different levels of giving and incentives. And I think this is really fun because the different levels of giving and incentives are unique to the project. And so if you were to give $10 or more, you got a virtual high five. Just a, hey, thank you, that's really meaningful, we appreciate it. But then you can see through the different donor levels, it gets a little bit more creative. So my favorite is, if you were to give $250, you would get a signed spray can. And so the artist would sign it, and a spray can maybe cost, what, $10 at the most. But it's really meaningful because it's signed, it's really showing, hey, this is special, you've really invested, the artist appreciates it. And so thinking about creative ways of building in different incentives for donations can be fun and effective. Also think about in-kind contributions. This can sometimes be just as valuable as cash. And when we include in-kind in our budget, especially, it's showing the true cost of our operations. So here's one example of a list that a Main Street program just put down on a big piece of paper, took a picture of it, posted it on their Facebook page, and within a week, all of these items were donated. There are always going to be people out there who have some of these small and big things, right? And they don't know that you need it or could benefit from it unless you ask and put it out there. So don't be afraid to say, hey, here's what we need in order to do our jobs effectively. When we think about special events, events do play a vital role in the fund development plan. Not only can special events help raise dollars, but they also build relationships. They can cultivate new donors and introduce people to your organization. But it's important to choose the right event to raise funds for your organization. So once you've decided on the right event, and by right event, usually that means it's aligned with your strategy, your transformation strategy. If you've already been through that process, that'll probably make more sense. If not, we can talk about that as we visit your communities, but making sure it makes sense for your community and the vision. And so this is an example from Boonton, New Jersey. They put together a brew fest. They had 30 New Jersey craft breweries with unlimited samplings of over 65 beers. Usually alcohol is a great way to bring adults out to the community. They also had 10 to 15 cuisine offerings. They had live bands and a DJ, some adult games like cornhole, Jenga. This was a really neat way for them as a community to leverage what they already are really good at, which is brewing beer. And it brought people together, and it's a fun way to do fundraising as well. Another example of an event that was used for fundraising is in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. So this actually just came through my inbox yesterday. They're putting together a downtown disco. And, many of us have seen or maybe hosted Dancing with the Stars in our community. This is actually a disco dance off, and it features, different favorite townies who've agreed to, I love that they said, boogie for donations. Also really popular right now are silent disco parties. If you don't know what that is, Google it. It's really fun. But this is a way to sell tickets, make it fun, and really just make it special. The same community also during COVID had a really successful virtual fundraiser. So now that we're, in this age of Zoom and we're all very used to and comfortable with online interactions, think about virtual fundraising. So, one thing that they did during COVID that I think would still be very effective, not post COVID, but where we are now, is they had sold tickets at $65 for folks to participate in a live auction. And so that ticket in advance, that got folks a $15 gift certificate to a downtown eatery of their choice. They were delivered ice cream from a local ice cream parlor to enjoy the night of the live Facebook event. They were also delivered a growler of beer from a local brewery, and they were entered into a competition to win a staycation. And so it makes it really fun to be involved, but in a way that doesn't force you to go out. We're all really short on time, and sometimes it's easier to do things from the comfort of our own home. Through this event, they were able to raise $17,000 in one night, which is pretty incredible. Another example is in Wheeling, West Virginia. They have a competition for small businesses called Show of Hands. Really, how this works is they have an event, they have attendees make a donation of at least $5, and that $5 gets them a vote. So they have 4 pre-selected proposals for projects that benefit the community. Those are presented, and attendees are able to cast their vote for the project that they want to help fund. And so it's a way for people to be involved at a price point that is not prohibitive. And then they're able to actually see during that event the winner and feel like they're a part of making change in their community. In Lebanon, Oregon, one way that they're looking to enhance sustainable donors is by asking for donors to give $5 regularly. And that's a really great way to get people involved on a consistent basis, but again, without making it prohibitive. And so when we think about monthly giving programs, that's going to help us predict our revenue. It's going to create this multiplier effect as, all these little small $5 gifts can add up to larger revenue. It's going to help us increase our overall donor giving for maybe someone who can only give a small amount at a time. It helps us increase our donor retention. Monthly donors are far more likely to continue giving than someone who gives a gift once or twice a year. And so just some tips for if you want to think about setting up a sustainable donor program. Create a fun name for a giving club. That's going to help promote the monthly giving and have a sense of identity to it. Set a base gift and 3 or 4 giving levels for the club. And so making sure that you're quantifying the gift amounts, for example, $20 per month will help us fill in the blank. Also think about creating ways for people to sign up and give. Make it easy for people to donate online through PayPal, Venmo. There's so many different ways to make payments nowadays. Try to customize your platform to work with as many of these as possible. Promote the Giving Club in all of your regular communications, and maybe host a special event or a special campaign to cultivate those first founding members of the Giving Club. A lot of us are also looking for revenue related to specific projects. And so when you're thinking about something as simple as a flower basket, making it really fun and eye-catching. And I really love this graphic. It catches your eye, it's fun. It also has the information you need. What is the deadline for donating? What is their funding goal? And what are my donations going to cover? If your downtown has a really unique um, asset, it could be whatever signage, you name it. One example here is from the Milk District in Orlando, Florida. Their downtown has a ton of neon signs, and they've really become known for their neon signs. And so once a year, they sell a Milk District neon sign for $89, and it becomes this really just cool way to bring a little bit of downtown home, and it's been very successful for them. They do it through a pre-order, and it's something that you're not going to find in any other community. A lot of us during the holiday season, we will sell things like ornaments for fundraising. Just wanted to throw this out here. Think about maybe something no one else is doing. One great example of that is maybe you have a local winery, brewery, whatever it may be, coffee shop. Have them create or craft something specific to Main Street and have that be a once a year collectible or unique item that you can buy for yourself or buy and gift to others. Merchandise sales, I love merchandise sales because they cover a lot of different things. Yes, fundraising, but also it's going to really help instill pride in your community if people are able to rep where they're from. And so just wanted to plug our Shop Main Street website. I know for local programs, Main Street America is looking at ways to brand community merchandise so that you can purchase through there. Also, they're looking at bulk pricing. So just keep an eye out for that. But we do have our Shop Main Street site that just recently launched. Just a note on endowments. A lot of these things we've covered are looking at more of the short term. But if you've never had a rainy day fund, plan one in the years to come. Thinking about setting aside a small percentage of your revenue to go toward that, soliciting funds specifically for that purpose, maybe thinking about high school alumni, or even maybe folks who can donate stock. Think about short term and long term. Donor development cycle, the idea here is that you're going to rinse and repeat. You want to recruit, you want to learn, you want to engage, you want to ask, you want to think, and then repeat. Fund development is a continual process, and we don't ever want to think that there's a start and end because it really just keeps going. Last comment here, just wanted to note that success when it comes to fundraising is going to rely on how well you tell your story. So don't forget to tell folks what you're doing now to help downtown, what your future plans are, how you plan to add value to the community, and making sure your wrap up is key. Bring everything home with a specific ask, take time to think about what outcome you want, and more than anything, make the ask. People don't donate because they're not asked. And so we need to put our Hoosier humility aside and just go out there, put ourselves out there and ask for help when we need it. That's a lot of information. I'm happy to take some questions. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And Abby, I'm going to let you tell me if there are any questions or.
Yeah, I haven't seen any in the chat, but please feel free to throw them in there. I know that was a lot of content, but I'll send the PowerPoint, some of the information that Jackie mentioned throughout as well in the follow-up. But yeah, just are there any questions about what she covered?
Or even other ideas that have worked really well for your community that maybe I didn't cover. I love learning from you guys too.
Hopefully we didn't scare y'all away with the. Well, Another thing that I'll just quickly mention while I give people a second if they have any other questions, is, I know earlier we mentioned, when you're doing kind of that audit of different potential ways to get funding, one of the things mentioned was grants. And I think grants are amazing. There's lots of different grants at all different levels that you can get. But one thing we've talked a lot about lately was just don't plan on getting a grant. If you're like, they might be a considered part of potentially what can add to your budget, but don't assume that you're for sure going to get, a grant and kind of be leaning on that. So that was one thought I had earlier. Oh, Heart of Jasper talked about they did a soup pour, the arts where there's ceramic bowls and soup. And so, okay, yeah, I've been to one of those before too. That's really cool. It was like a lunchtime. That's great.
That is really fun.
All right. Well, Lexi said this year we're going to try doing a dresser duck race and race rubber duckies in the Wabash. That's awesome. That
That
feels
is
like a
really
really
cool.
unique, one of those unique things that Jackie was mentioning, like making it something that's different and just for your community. Um,
One thing I'll add too is like make sure after you finish a large fundraiser that you're auditing that. Um, if it's dead, if you're not getting the turnout that you have been getting in past years, it might be time to change it up. It might be getting stale. So really make sure just because this is a fundraiser you've always done, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to continue doing it. Look at changing it up or creating something new.
All right, well, it's 11:01, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Jackie, thank you so much for all of that information, just for going through it. Again, I know it was a lot, everyone, but it's really necessary. So please take time to go back through the PowerPoint. We'll have this recorded so you can go back and watch it again. And yeah, thanks for taking time to be here today. So bye, everyone. Talk
Thanks
to you
all.
soon. It's recording.